If I do come back again, I'm going to use the same picture. In scriptural language, there's something called an inclusio. And what an inclusio is you have, for instance, a gospel or a passage that begins with a word or a phrase, and at the end of that passage or paragraph or pericope or gospel, there's another word or phrase that kind of encapsulates it. And like, for instance, at the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, it says this is the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And at the end, the centurion, looking up at Jesus, says, surely this is the Son of God. So they create kind of bookends. And so I wanted to begin today, the end of the retreat, the last conference, with the way we began the retreat. With that prayer from the God who won't let go, Peter Van Bremen. And wondering if, at this point of hearing that prayer, it doesn't mean something a little more different. Or perhaps a little more profound. I marvel at your desire for my company. I stand in awe that your love finds and chooses me. For I had given up all hope of ever being addressed so lovingly by anyone. And now you choose me and tell me that I make a difference to you. Utterly amazed, I experience myself differently because of your choice. I learn to appreciate myself in a new way. I see my worth and my contribution when I look at myself with your eyes. How can I begin to thank you? Amen. Amen. I wanted to comment, before I begin really the talk today, about this. And it's so touchy.
We can't hear you.
Yeah, I know. I'm trying to modify this sound a little bit. It gets so touchy. In the Spanish culture, among the Mexicans, we have something called Las Posadas. We also have the novenas to Our Lady of Guadalupe. And when I went to my first Las Posada is supposed to kind of mimic Mary and Joseph going from house to house looking for a place to stay and everybody saying no. In fact, people dress up like Mary and Joseph. Yeah. And they'll stand outside the door and the song goes back and forth. Can we come in? No, you cannot. And then finally they let them in. When I arrived at my first Las Posada, I looked at the song sheet and there were like 1 million songs. And I thought to myself, we're not going to sing all these songs. Like, we're going to be here forever. And we did. And I don't know how they have it timed or the way it works. It was always 2 hours. And then after that you have food or whatever else. So I knew when I was going to a place, it was always 2 hours. They sang all the songs. They worked in all the mysteries. They did a rosary. And it was beautiful. And I went everywhere from larger houses to trailer parks. In fact, the one trailer I was in was packed with people. There was nowhere, and they stand for the whole thing. That's why I thought when I looked at this song sheet, there's no way I'm standing for this whole thing. But I did. And I go to this one trailer, and I'm in there, and I just hear this, psst. I wonder what that is. And we're still singing and doing all these things, then I hear it again, psst. And the room smells so good. Well, after a while, I realized I was in the one open spot, and that's where they had one of those air freshener sprayers, which is right behind my head, and it started dripping down my back. I never smelled so good in my life. And they all start laughing, like they know. It's like nobody stood there, but Padre's standing there, and exactly, it's like a trap. And that just, talk about breaking the ice. it just broke down. They're like, oh, come on in, you know, and it was a beautiful, beautiful experience. I would go to some places and I could not clearly see the address, but I could hear singing. And I followed the singing. And before too long, I would walk up, and in the window, I could see a framed picture of Our Lady of Guadalupe. I'm like, okay, this is the place. You know, so the singing is so important, and we are a singing people. We really are. You don't hear it in church all the time. And I have to tell you, on the men's retreat that I did here as well, and on Quo Vadis days, where it's all teenagers and young 27-something men, they sing. They sing. And it's so beautiful to hear. You wish you could take that out. And so, you know, the title of today's talk is Go and Do Likewise. And there's 2 points I want to make on this amidst others in the presentation. The first is, you were on this retreat and you benefited from all the people who worked on this retreat. Maybe it's time to be a worker. And so after, you know who the hostesses are, you know who the people are in charge, to be able to commit and say, I'm coming next year and I'll do whatever you need to do. To go back to the church, maybe you can't do that. You go back to the church, and what can you do in the church? How can you commit yourself? Even if it's, you know, people say, well, I don't have any gifts to offer. Anyone can pray. In McSherrystown, we're lucky enough to have an adoration chapel. And they're looking for people to fill times. I mean, that takes no effort at all. You go to your upper room for an hour and be there. What a wonderful way to contribute to that. So go and do likewise means that not only can you help out with this women's retreat and encourage that, but you can also become an active member within the church. It's so important. And to dialogue with people. It's really what I want to talk about today, is the way we are community. We need community. Many addiction counselors and likewise have gone into saying, you know, amidst all the things we try to do for addicts, the one thing that we don't do is create a community for them of support, which is so important. And maybe if we could create those communities of support, we wouldn't need all the other things we spend all this money on that seem to be Band-Aids. You know? And that goes for anything, not just addiction, but people who necessarily need a support group outside of the church. So to go and do likewise is to take what you've gained over these few days and to take it beyond what is here. So today, the roller coaster kind of slows down and it begins to go into the bay, and then you get off. Now what? You throw up. No. Now what? Well, you can get on another ride. There are plenty of retreats around. You know, there are plenty of opportunities. I showed a number of YouTube videos. Just so you know, the whole thing is recorded. I will send the links to these recordings that are on YouTube to Bonnie, and she can disseminate them to your email. It will be in a text document. So I'll give you the URL, and I think most text documents, when they show up on your computer, sometimes the link is highlighted or whatever. That would be the links to all the videos I showed here, the links to some of the resources that I'm going to be giving you today, and certainly to the videos that are here, because I don't want you to be, well, what was that I heard that gave me chills and now I can't remember? That one over there, exactly. So I throw that out to you. So we get off the roller coaster, what do? Now we have to go out, and you know, the apostles, Jesus ascends to heaven, they're standing there looking at the sky, 2 angels show up and say, he ain't coming back. So you got to move. You got to work. You can't just stay here looking up at the sky saying, well, we're going to wait till he comes back and do nothing. We look at the world and sometimes it can be so overwhelming, and we think there's no way that little me, can make a change. And yet we know sometimes it's those individuals who do very extraordinary things that make a change. A number of months ago, there was a revival at Asbury College. Maybe you've heard this. Yeah. And at Asbury College, at this revival, there are about 50 people. And this one guy gets up in the middle of the revival, and he makes a public confession. Confesses all his sins that he's ever committed. And as he finishes his confession, people come up. No more than 50 people there. People come up, and they pray with him, and they embrace him, and then another one gets up and does it. Before you know it, in a few hours, there are hundreds of people there doing the same thing. And after a couple days, constant revival, there are thousands of people there from all over the world. Through social media, they connected or whatever else. What were they doing? Why would they come from a foreign country or foreign place to go and confess their sins? Because there's redemption there. That one guy who got up and humbled himself and confessed all his sins, he threw up in front of everybody. Changed thousands of people by doing nothing extraordinary. He just humbled himself and confessed his sins. So I want to present some boring statistics to you first, because I think it's good that we have an awareness of what's going on. So those of you who came early got a sneak preview. This pie chart represents statistics from the year 2000. Okay, this is from Pew Research, so add or subtract a little bit. Non-Catholic Christian is in the blue. Roman Catholics is in that kind of orange. Unaffiliated is yellow. And then non-Christian is this large part over here. Now I say non-Christian because they don't identify as anything. When I say unaffiliated, they identify as Christian, but it could be any number of different, or I identify as spiritual, or they identify as something, in other words. But that big halfway blue thing, they identify as nothing. They would consider themselves pretty much non-religious, even though the statistic says non-Christian, non-religious. So then we move up. So among Roman Catholics, 65 million Roman Catholics in the United States, roughly in 2000. And then there's that gray section, 40 million, which is 14%. That is inactive Roman Catholics. All right? Roman Catholics. Okay? A third of the country, Roman Catholic. But 40 million inactive. And some of them remain in name Roman Catholic. For some reason, and I'm telling you this so you know the truth. For some reason, people stay Catholic even though they're not Catholic because they want to be buried in a church. You don't have to do that. Don't worry. Okay? Now, I don't want you to leave the Catholic Church, but I'm just saying, people will stay Catholic, or I don't want to remove my registration because I want to be buried. You can be buried virtually everywhere, at any church. You really can. So I don't want that to concern you. But that's why why would they tell people they're Roman Catholic, but they just don't practice the faith well, that's the reason. So let's move up a little bit. 2010.
Father,
Yes.
what about Christers?
Yeah, that would be like the people who come to Christmas and Easter. That would be inactives too, pretty much. Yes, they're included in that inactive. When we talk about active, they would have asked the people, do you attend Mass regularly? Yes. It's funny when I do wedding or marriage interviews sometimes, I'll say, do you actively practice the faith? They say yes. And I say, so you come to Mass every Sunday? Oh, no. All right. Just to clarify. And then it's funny because then we ask their fiancé, do they actively practice the faith? And as a good fiancé, they're like, yes, they do. They're so faithful. And then, no. So 2010, we go up. We have 58,900,000 Catholics, 43 inactive. Let's rewind a little bit here. 40, 43. 65, 58. But the population's still growing. Okay? So regardless of these statistics, the population's still growing. The 61 million. From 20 million unaffiliated to 61 unaffiliated. So they're no longer, I'm Christian. A lot of them are just saying, I'm Christian. But they're not they're Lutheran, Episcopalian, whatever. They're whatever. I'm unaffiliated. I don't want to be identified with any religion because I'm spiritual, not religious necessarily. Okay? So 2020, 61 million. Now remember, the population is continuing to grow each year too. So that's why we want to do percentages. So we look at 61 million Catholics, 43 million inactive Catholics. 58 to 61. Unaffiliated, I hit the wrong button. Unaffiliated, 61 to 76. All right? So again, not affiliated with any particular thing. Now, 61,900,000 Catholics, more or less. Of that, 21 million are Latino. 21 million are Spanish. And that's only growing. And so, I think it's so important. We can learn a lot of things here because many of the Mexicans I deal with are much like we were in the 50s and 60s. They still have Sunday dinner. You know, everyone comes in for that. They don't answer the phone while they're eating, when they're together. They still go to Mass. Everything revolves around the parish. If they're helping in the parish, their kids are helping in the parish. On Wednesday evenings, we have the Charismaticos, the charismatic group that celebrates their service. They bring their kids. So now we have a charismatic group for the kids too. You know, it's all encompassing. Haiti, Lupian, who is helping to be an altar server, her parents, and she's one of 4, her parents are in the charismatic movement there in the church. And they brought her from the time she was a little kid, which is why she's now involved in it, you know, and stays involved in it. So I think that's so important to look at that and see the reverence. They have a novena for everything. So it's Guadalupe. It might be for St. Jude. It might be for the patron saint of their particular town. It might be for the Nativity, Las Posadas. It might be for Tres Reyes, or the Three Kings Day. I mean, when someone dies, they have the rosary for 9 days in the house to pray for the person who's dying. And then after 30 days, they have a Mass. Much like the Italians used to do too, a month's mind Mass. And then a year after, they have a Mass. So it's so important, these traditions in the church, where we've gotten away and we're kind of like, well, if I go on Sunday, I've kind of done it. I've checked the box, but it can be so much more than that. So we celebrate today Corpus Christi, and the Eucharist is what really differentiates us from all other churches. We have the Eucharist. I remember my buddy who's Methodist, we went out to a cabin far north in Pennsylvania before I was a priest, and I said, I need to find a local parish. And he said, why? Because he's Methodist. And he said, we can just pray here. And I said, you don't understand. You know, we have the Eucharist. And he said, well, we have communion too. And they do have communion, but it's not the same thing. And he didn't get it. He just, you know, he said, well, it's not a sin in our church. Why don't you come join our church? You know, it's not a sin there. You can have an easier life. And yes, we go back to that bumper sticker. If all truths are equal, I'm going to find an easier faith to live. Quite frankly. So when we talk about the faith and how rich it is and how important it is, I want you to see a video of this. And I apologize ahead, it's so pixelated because I literally ripped it from a VHS tape to digital. And I am not technical, but I did it. It was a miracle. It didn't work necessarily as well, but anyway. And the picture is called Romero. And Romero, back in the 60s, El Salvador, you know, they had wars and civil wars and all this stuff. And the church was being attacked because the church was seen as political. And they were political because they were talking about stuff like freedom. And so all the churches get locked down. Well, priests and bishops are being assassinated left and right. And so they need to elect a new archbishop. And they choose Romero because he's a bookworm. Like, he's not political at all. He's like milquetoast. And he studies all the time, and he reads, and he's not a good speaker or anything else. And what they find out shortly after they choose him is that the Spirit has moved his heart in a way that is unbelievable. And as we celebrate Corpus Christi today, the body of Christ, I think it's important that we see this and observe this and really understand, you know, what people are willing to do if we truly believe that Jesus Christ is present in the Eucharist.
centuries ago on that hill outside of Jerusalem.
That message is for us. You have not suffered alone. And you see the power of the people. I was in Mexico for 2 months, long after I'd been put in a Spanish parish. So it didn't really help the language part. It was their effort at goodwill. But I took 14 seminarians from Mount St. Mary's down there and was responsible for them. I learned much about the culture while I was down there, which was so valuable. And the front of many of the homes looks like this in the ranchos. The ranchos were out in the country. Oftentimes it was like a village built around 2 buildings, a bathroom and a church. So they had a bathroom for the whole town, and then they had a church, and that was the center of activity. So in the cities, many of the houses looked like this from the front, and it was very humble, very comfortable and cool. And then you would walk into the backyard, and you would see that. It was almost like the Garden of Eden. And you could get guayaba, you could get mango, and all these fruits, you know, lemon, right off the tree. And many people looking at this might say, oh, they're so poor. They don't know what poor means. It's a relative term. Because they were so happy. They were so happy. They didn't have all the things that sometimes we surround our life with, which actually aren't as convenient, but cause us stress. And so I was in a rancho in General Cepeda. General Cepeda is near Juarez, where all the gangland stuff is happening. And we went to these ranchos, and we were missionaries, and I was a priest, and I could have been the president. Like, when I came there, they said, we have a priest. News went out throughout all the village. And they immediately came to their chapel in town, and they would open the doors and birds would fly out and animals would come out and everything else, and they would all go in there and clean. They would clean it, and that because they haven't had a priest maybe in a few months. And so the whole town comes out. They bring out all the children and all the food and everything else. And so I'm in this rancho area among the pigs. Sometimes they'd come to Mass, sometimes they wouldn't. Most of them were inactive, as it were. But because the temples were open, the chapels were open more or less, we had perritos, little dogs, and everything else come in. I walked around like that most of the time. And the reason is I could wear shorts underneath that owl. And it was so hot because it's a desert area. And so we would teach Sunday school to the children. And some of these children, you'll see many of them, like this one is wearing a shirt, MTV. Many of them are things, like you send it to community aid, and then a lot of that stuff will go down there or whatever. I saw one girl wearing a shirt that said Future Playboy Playmate. And it had a bunny on it, and she liked it because of the bunny. I mean, I couldn't get that out of my head. I'm like, honey, we gotta get you another shirt. Milagros Guadalupe, right here, the 9-year-old, showed up to everything. She was so good. Her name literally means the miracles of Guadalupe. And just fantastic. So here, I'm teaching them about dinosaurs. I'm actually a velociraptor. I'm walking around like this. And then we started running around and scaring, and you know, it's funny, the people are looking at me like, is he really a priest? Is he really? But we were having a great time. What you will notice here is the absence of men. And the reason is, they work. So they'll go out in the vineyards, they'll go out in the orchards, some of them come here for months at a time to pick apples or whatever else, and then they'll go back and be with their families. So for the most part, the women run this town. Like it takes a village to raise the children, literally. So here we have them outside, and I'm with the seminarian from the Mount, and we're teaching them. They have all these like hand-me-down desks. They'll use that chapel area as a school and as a chapel. It's kind of, you know, everything mixed in there. And they were so, they don't usually sit down like this and learn, but they were just, oh, tell us everything. They were so eager for it. We had no behavior problems at all. We had none. They were just so grateful that we were there. this is the chapel that we were in. So you can see how small it is, and it stayed pretty cool in there. The open air. There's a group I saw after Mass. And this girl, she's 15, and she'll probably be married in 2 years. She'll raise her family there, and that's what they do. She's kind of the matriarch. In the Spanish culture, more than I've seen anywhere else, the primos are important, the cousins, and you can get in trouble for disobeying your older cousin. You can get in trouble for disobeying your older sibling, because they're in charge when your parents aren't. So, like, she might have been a cousin or a neighbor to all these kids, and they obey her as if she is the mother. Here we are in the chapel. So you can see it's a nice, tiny little chapel. There are some missionaries who are with us. And so you get to see, they have such a desire to receive the Eucharist. We kind of take it for granted because we go to daily Mass, But they might not have it for 6 months. I had a wedding when I was in Guanajuato, a 16 and a 17-year-old. I didn't even know their names. And I was there for the wedding because I had parishioners in Lebanon who were family members, extended family. So I'm in this rancho, and they're welcoming me, and I see these 2 large pigs. I did not see them later. But I had the best carnitas I ever had. So at this wedding, the priest comes up in a little VW bug, and he gets out of the bug, and he's wearing an alb and a stole. He starts hearing confessions right away. And so it's getting closer and closer to time for the wedding. Well, what is time? I mean, they'll have it when it happens, They're all there. Everybody's there. They're partying. They're going to have a wedding. So at the end of a confession, he pauses. He steps up. He says in Spanish, "Do you know how to do a wedding?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Thank you." And he got in his car. And he left. So please tell me your name so I can marry you. He had had 8 Masses already. He was going from rancho to rancho, hearing confessions, celebrating Mass. Hearing confessions, celebrating Mass. And that's what he did. I mean, I think as a priest, we got to be easy. As busy as we are, we're not that busy. But it was beautiful. The faith of the couple. They have this tradition, and I just found this out. Maybe it's just among the Mexicans. After the rehearsal, the one night, they said, "Are you coming to the house?" I never go to receptions, wedding receptions. Just don't do it. The first time I went to one, I was seated with the limousine driver and the photographer. And I saw some things that I shouldn't see. So anyway, I'll go to the rehearsal dinner for a wedding just so I can get dirt on the couple. And I can say that the next day. But I said, they said, "Are you coming back to the house?" And I said, "Well, I wasn't going to, but I can." And they said, "We need this blessing." So what they do is the bride and the groom go to the bride's home, and there's a kneeler there, and there's a Bible and a cross, and there are their baptismal candles. And they light the baptismal candles. And then I go up and I lift the cross and I bless them with the cross. And then their mothers and fathers come up and pick up the cross and bless them with the cross. And then their friends and relatives come up and bless them with the cross and pray for them and give them advice and support. They're kneeling the whole time for this. And then afterwards, there's a final blessing. We bless the objects that they're going to be given tomorrow, whether it's a bracelet or a medal or something else. And then they eat. It was wonderful. It was a beautiful blessing of the couple before they get married the next day. And so these traditions are so important. But I don't want us to believe that we don't have this in our own potential, really, about the Eucharist. I was at World Youth Day. Bishop Rhodes said, "I want you to take a group to a World Youth Day." So I blame him for the whole thing. It was in Madrid. We started out in Lourdes. We went through Burgos and into Madrid. And Lourdes is wonderful. If you can ever get there, go. Don't question it, just go. But I had kids from Lebanon Catholic, and I had just been assigned to St. Joan of Arc. So I was split between 2 groups, and we went there. And the way the trip was measured out, we were eventually supposed to make get ourselves to an abandoned airfield. in Madrid, where they were going to have World Youth Day with the Holy Father Benedict the 16th and everything else. They didn't work out the logistics. So they expected 1 million people on this airfield. 2 million showed up. The porta-johns were filled in the first hour. All right? There were no paths, so EMTs could not get in anywhere because it was just solid people. It was chaos. When we walked in, to our left and right were nude sunbathers. And our kids, like many of them were struck blind at that moment. And they asked a good question. They said, are these people Catholic? Because for some it wasn't. It was a European party. They came to be, together with, to see the Pope and everything else. So we get out on this airfield. We're supposed to spend the night there. We get out there, there's nowhere, like the spot we were supposed to stay in is already occupied. Many times over. There's no water, it's hot, there's no bathrooms, there's no EMT access or anything else. And so the sky's getting dark, it's starting to thunder and lightning. It's just a total disaster. So I say we're getting our group out of here. I don't want to be responsible for this. You guys get stampeded or anything else. We're in Europe, we're in a foreign place. So we take our group back to the hotel. And then Bishop McFadden says, we want all groups to come back from the airfield to the hotel. But they couldn't communicate with anyone out there. So I went back to the airfield with the lady who was the assistant. I can't remember her name. She was from St. Francis in Harrisburg. Short little Puerto Rican lady, but a powerhouse. And she and I went there, and she couldn't see. Because people are all up here, and she's just like going through the corn maze. So I said to her, you stay here at this giant post, and I will send groups to you, and then you usher them out. And it was like a party, and Benedict was there on stage, and he would start a prayer, and then an air horn would go off. Or people would yell, or just this carrying on, and it started thundering and lightning. And so we even had trouble, Virginia was her name. When we were trying to get in, they wouldn't let us in. They said, it's packed, it's full. And as we're trying to get in, we're trying to negotiate with the cops. People behind us are counting. And they're counting down. And the cops are locking arms. Because this is going to be a stampede. Catholics trying to get into this. And the moment they counted down, they stampeded. They ran over the metal detectors and everything else. So now it's open. It's wide open. Anyone can go in. So I told Virginia, we got to get these kids out. But there's air horns going on. People are dancing. People are jumping up and down. There's nowhere to see. And so I guess Benedict the 16th at this point thought, I'm not even going to start praying because it's not going to happen. And people were just carrying on, and I'm thinking, Lord, I got to get these people out. And then all of a sudden, he spoke to one of his masters of ceremony. And the master of ceremony walked off to the side, and then what happened was a giant monstrance came through the floor of the stage. And everybody dropped. Everybody got quiet. And so when we're going into this World Youth Day, it's raining, it's storming, the wind is terrible, and then that monstrance comes up. And everybody, regardless of why they were there, they stopped. Everything stopped. And I literally had to pause for a minute. And then I found my groups. Because everyone was kneeling. And you could see signs and everything. And we got them out of there. So even for us, when we're pushed to a certain extent, we see the power of that. It is there. And go and do likewise. We have to be the ones to take that out to the people. So how do we do that in the midst of all this? We can be overwhelmed. I'm just one person. And how do we do that? Well, it goes back to where we started. We go back to the Word. Like He gives us everything we need. And to be able to meditate on this in a way that it activates our life is so important and so powerful. How does this work? Well, we've all heard that story from John's Gospel, the woman caught in adultery. And sometimes we read the Bible or we hear it so many times that we really don't think about asking why. So for instance, this woman is caught in the act of adultery, which means she's probably half naked or completely naked. She's dragged through town, past her neighbors, relatives, even her friends, people who knew her. She's dragged through town in front of them all to the feet of the one maybe she's been waiting to meet for a long time, but not like this. And as she approaches Jesus, and they say, well, we caught her in the act of adultery, she should be killed, what do you say? He doesn't say anything. He bends down and he starts tracing in the dust. And then he says to them, which one of you who has not sinned, you can cast the first stone. And then he continues to write in the dust, as one by one they walk away. The oldest to the youngest, because the oldest are wiser, knowing I got a lot more baggage. And they walk away. What did he write? This is the only time it says Jesus wrote anything in Scripture. Don't you think it's kind of important what he wrote? I mean, nobody read it. Nobody took a snap of it, to pass on for later. This is important. Or is it? Maybe what he wrote is not as important as why he wrote. Or maybe he didn't write anything. Maybe he just drew a picture. Why did he get down as that woman was brought toward him and begin to write? Because when it says anaopto in Greek, then he looked up at her. That he would be looking up into the eyes of someone whose eyes are downcast and embarrassed and humiliated. That's our God. That's important. He looks up into the eyes of he humbles himself to look up into the eyes of a sinner. And then he says, go and do likewise. We've all seen this image. Every Holy Thursday, this is the gospel, even though Holy Thursday is about the Eucharist and priesthood, but it's always the washing of the feet. What I find fascinating here is in the washing of the feet, Jesus washed all the apostles' feet, even Judas. Can you imagine getting to the one who you know is going to betray you, who's going to change the future of your life forever, even lead to your death, and you wash their feet? Now, in Roman law and even Jewish law, they did have slaves back then, but there were some laws that protected slaves, that there were some things not even a slave could be asked to do. And the one thing a slave could never be asked to do is that. A slave could not be asked to wash anyone else's feet. Which is why Peter's like, what are you doing? Not even a slave can do this. And he says it to him. He said, what I'm doing now, you don't understand, but you will later. It later on says in this gospel, do you see what I have done? And again, the translation, I don't like it because it's not directly from the Greek. They tried to make it more understandable in English. Do you see what I have done for you? That's not what it says. It says literally, do you see what I have done to you? In other words, you're changed now. You can't go back. Do you see what I have done to you? Then you go and do likewise. So what is the temptation? This is the sower and the seed. We've heard that story a million times. The sower goes out to sow, and we're all frustrated by it. Because we're like, he doesn't know anything about planting at all. Right? What the heck are you doing? You're sowing the seed, and then you're letting, all this stuff. In the ancient world, and even now, still in the Middle East, they farm different than we do. Space is at a premium. And so they don't plow and then put down the seeds and then cover up. They have rocky ground. They have ground that's on the path. They have ground among thorns. They want to use every bit of ground they can because they're providing food for their family. So what they do is they scatter the seed everywhere. And then they go back and they plow it under. And that's how they do it. They chop up the ground and work it in. So what really is the seed, the sin of the sower? Procrastination. Now I know none of you ever procrastinate, but there are people who do, all right? What do I mean by procrastination? I mean today you leave here and then you go back to civilization, uncivilized civilization. And you're like, well, maybe I'll read that tomorrow, or maybe I'll try that upper room thing next weekend when I'm more relaxed. And in the meantime, the thorns grow up, the birds come down, people walk over it. It only takes a little while. And so when Jesus says, go and do likewise, he wants us to go forward. He wants us to go out and make that difference in the world. And like we said, it's the little things. It doesn't have to be big things. Someone humbling themselves, someone entering into dialogue with someone else is all we really need to do. But I think so often we can be so focused on the rest of the world that we forget ourselves. It might interest you to know this, or it might not interest you to know this, but I am free of all ailments right now. After a whole weekend of hell, all right? So, and I say that because this happens all the time. There are plenty of impediments to doing what we should do. And if we can overcome those impediments, it's amazing what can happen. And so with the sower and the seed and all these lessons, the lesson is that we go out and we engage people, but we first have to engage ourselves. We first have to look, why am I feeling this way? Why am I doing this? What's happening? So as I was sleeping last night after that interrogation session, I had a dream. And in this dream, I died and I went up for judgment. And there was St. Peter. And St. Peter is standing there and he says, okay, what I'd like you to do, and he handed me a slate and a piece of chalk. He said, I would like you to take a moment and record every sin you've ever committed. So I got down and I started writing. When lo and behold, someone else comes up to the gates. And they don't pause, they just run right through. And I looked and it was Bonnie. First of all, Bonnie, why are you in my dream? Secondly, okay, I know she's a pretty nice girl and everything, but she didn't pause, she didn't ask, she just ran right through. Now come on. And St. Peter looks at me and he said, don't you worry, son. She's just going to get more chalk. That's not true, but it could be. I say that because sometimes, again, we're so focused on everyone else, and we need to look at the self. And if we can change the self, oh, profound things can happen as a result of that. And so I want to encourage you, in that way. I have a little link here. I hope this works out. I don't know how to do this stuff all the time, but I think this will certainly give us some food for thought as we go from here. Yeah. Don't listen to the ad.
The thing that's different about a verbal vacation
Yeah, don't listen to that ad either.
you always have the whole
20 things we should say more often. Number 20, thank you. And not just on Thanksgiving, every day. Number 19, excuse me. Number 18, here's a surprise corn dog that I bought you because you're my friend. Remember you want corn dogs? More happy people? Good idea. Corn dog for you, corn dog for you, corn dog for you. Number 17, I'm sorry. Number 16, I forgive you. Number 15, you can do it! But don't say it if it's something you can't do. Number 14, another thing that we should say more often, I have barbecue sauce in my shirt too. Drop the barbecue sauce on somebody else's shirt, take even look at the barbecue sauce on your own shirt. Number 13, please. Number 12, everything is going to be okay. Number 11, oh, you got me a corn dog too? You shouldn't have, buddy. I don't know. I know a lot of people who need to say that. You're so awesome, I named my dog after you. That could hurt someone's feelings. I mean, boat. I named my boat after you. Boat. You're so awesome, I legally changed my name to yours. Just tell people they're awesome and mean it. 8, hello, person that I've never met before. Here's a high five. Number 7, my sports team is not always the best sports team. It takes a big man to say that. Nothing. Sometimes that's the best thing you can say. Number 5. Was just really funny. Number 4. I disagree with you, but I still like you as a person who is a human being, and I'll treat you like that. Because if I didn't, it would make everything bad, and that's what lots of people do in this lane. I need a water break, y'all. It's okay to disagree, but it's not okay to be mean. Number 3. Sometimes you just gotta scream. Life is tough, but so are you. Sometimes we all need to be reminded to keep going. Number 1, something nice. Anything. If you can't think of anything nice to say, you're not thinking hard enough. So what about you? What do you think people should say more often? Leave a comment below and let's hear it. Oh, and I've got a bonus one for you. Something that we should say more often? Let's dance.
If I had that energy, I could take over the world. I want to thank you for this opportunity, and just to rehash very quickly. The exorcism of a woke culture is a casting out the darkness that has embedded itself in some movements that we experience in our world. And all these movements are created by people, but some of the people are victims of these movements. And it doesn't take us to lead a parade, it doesn't necessarily even take us, as Romero did, to necessarily walk in a church at the risk of our life. But what it takes us to do is to go beyond our own apprehensions, our own idiosyncrasies, and our prejudgments at times, to be like Christ to them, to go and do likewise, to wash the feet even of the person who is going to betray us, to bend down to meet the person who is caught in their sin, so that you can look up in their eyes and offer forgiveness. And if we do this, if we remain close to the sacraments and we receive our Lord in the most holy Eucharist, whose very nephesh, whose life force is within us in the form of grace, then we need not fear the evil one. The devil fears a soul that is filled with grace. And the best thing we can do is spread that grace far and wide. That the whole purpose of exercising a woke culture is not to win arguments or to make your voice be heard or to come out as an expert. The point is to go out to the lost sheep, the sheep who may have no one, and to lead them back to the Good Shepherd, that none of them might be lost, but that all of them will be raised up on the last day. Thank you. God bless you.